The Council voted against Earth and triggered their own doom. The vote was already over when I walked into the chamber. I could tell by the way they were sitting, loose, relaxed, the kind of posture you only hold when you have already decided something and are now simply waiting for the ceremony to end. 41 delegates from 41 species, seated in the curved rows of the Grand Deliberation Hall, and not one of them was looking at me. That was the first sign. My name is Owen Garrett. I had served as Earth's ambassador to the Galactic Council for 11 years. 11 years of handshakes I had to practice because their hands were not always hands. 11 years of speeches delivered through translation filters that flattened every word into something that barely carried meaning. 11 years of sitting in observer seats, in rooms where the real decisions were made before I arrived, smiling through it all because that was the job. I was 44 years old. I had spent more time in this building than I had in my own apartment back home. I knew where every hidden corridor led. I knew which delegate preferred silence before speaking and which ones performed their convictions loudly for the cameras. I knew the hall better than most of the species who built it. And I knew, the moment I saw those relaxed shoulders and averted eyes, that they had already voted. I sat down anyway. Protocol required it. I set my case on the table, opened my display, and looked out at the chamber with the same calm expression I had spent years perfecting. The High Arbiter, a towering being from the Cathara system whose name translated roughly to something between voice and stone, rose from the central seat and called the session to order. He did not look at me either. The charges were read aloud. I had heard them before in draft form, in whispered warnings from the two delegates who had actually tried to be fair with me. But hearing them read formally in the official record, with the translation filters broadcasting them across every diplomatic channel in the sector, was something different. It had weight. It had permanence. Earth was charged with maintaining unauthorized military development beyond the limits agreed upon during our observer admission. Earth was charged with refusing to submit resource extraction data from 4 outer colony sites for the past 3 review cycles. Earth was charged with conducting what the Council called unsanctioned contact with 17 species outside Council jurisdiction. Species the Council had classified as either too primitive for contact or too politically sensitive to approach without a full committee vote. I sat there and listened. I did not interrupt. I did not ask for the floor. Every charge was read with the flat, careful tone of something that had already been decided, not something being considered. When the final charge was entered into the record, the High Arbiter looked up from his reading surface, and for the first time since I had entered the room looked at me. "Ambassador Garrett," he said, "does Earth wish to respond before the formal record is closed?" I stood up. "Earth notes," I said, "that the charges as read omit several key contexts. We would welcome an opportunity to present those contexts to the full chamber." The Arbiter nodded slowly. "The chamber has reviewed the supporting material submitted by the Earth mission over the past 6 weeks. The record is considered complete." I looked around the room. 41 delegates. Most of them had their eyes on their own displays. A few were watching me with what I had learned to read as sympathy, not enough sympathy to change anything, but enough to feel slightly uncomfortable about it. 2 of them, the Veth delegate and the Sorathi delegate, were watching me with expressions I could not quite name. Not sympathy, something else. I made a note of that. "Then Earth has nothing further to add," I said, and sat back down. The vote took 4 minutes. The Arbiter collected the tallies from each delegation. He read the result in a voice that carried no emotion whatsoever, which was, I suspected, a practiced skill. 39 in favor of denial, 2 opposed. The containment accord was invoked. I had read the accord's full text 17 times in the past month. It was a document written 9,000 years ago to deal with a species that had tried to seed weaponized organisms across 3 neighboring systems. It had never been invoked against a species for anything less than an active act of interstellar aggression. Using it against Earth, against a species that had done nothing more than refuse to open every file cabinet on demand and talk to people the Council had not approved, was, by any honest reading, a remarkable stretch of its original intent. But they had the votes, and votes were the only currency that mattered in this building. The accord, as applied to Earth, meant the following. All Council-managed FTL transit lanes would be closed to human vessels within 90 days. All trade agreements operating through Council-affiliated networks would be suspended. Earth's observer status was revoked. Any species found conducting active trade with Earth during the containment period would face review and potential sanction. Humans living in Council-connected systems would not be expelled. That would have been too obvious, but they would lose their diplomatic protections. The arbiter finished reading the terms. He looked at me one final time. Ambassador Garrett, you will have 30 days to vacate the Earth mission offices. All credentials and access passes are suspended effective midnight tonight. The Council thanks Earth for its 60 years of observer participation and wishes the human species continued progress. He said continued progress, the way someone says goodbye to a person they never expect to see again. I picked up my case. I stood up. I looked around the chamber one more time at 39 faces that had, in the span of one session, decided to close every door they controlled and lock Earth outside. I did not argue. I did not plead. I did not make a speech about justice or history or the fact that we had come to this building 60 years ago with nothing but hope and had been handed a chair in the corner and told to wait ever since. I simply nodded, the way you nod when someone has confirmed exactly what you expected, and I walked toward the exit. Just before I reached the corridor, I activated my personal comm and sent a single line to Earth Command on the encrypted channel they had not yet blocked, because the access codes weren't revoked until midnight. They did it, begin protocol sovereign. I stepped out of the grand deliberation hall, and I did not look back. There was a long corridor beyond the chamber doors, lined with the memorial panels of every species that had ever joined the Council. 60 years ago, Earth's panel had been added at the very end of the row, a modest rectangle, polished and hopeful, with our planet's name in 17 languages. I walked past it without stopping. Outside, the station's artificial sky was set to late afternoon amber, the light warm and even and utterly indifferent to what had just happened inside. I stood on the observation deck and looked out at the docking bays below, where the Council's vessels moved in their steady patterns, and where, in Bay 47, the small human diplomatic shuttle waited for me. I had 48 hours before the access restrictions began, enough time. My assistant, a young woman named Claire who had been with the mission for 3 years and who had never once complained about the hours or the weight of what we carried, was waiting at the shuttle. She took one look at my face and did not ask how it went. The encrypted line confirmed receipt, she said quietly. Good, I said. She handed me a coffee, real coffee, from a small canister she kept hidden in her kit for moments exactly like this. I took it. It was good. It was the best thing that had happened all day. What happens now? She asked. I looked back at the station, at the amber light, at the Council's flags hanging above the main entrance, their colors representing thousands of years of civilization and order, and a particular kind of peace that had always had a price none of them had ever thought to mention clearly. Now, I said, they find out what 60 years of patience actually paid for. I finished the coffee, we boarded the shuttle. Behind us, the doors of the grand deliberation hall stayed exactly where they had always been. The difference was that we were done trying to walk through them. The news reached Earth in 12 hours. I know because I was watching the feed from the shuttle as we made our way back through the last open transit lane, we would be allowed to use for a while. It did not land the way the council expected. I had been in this business long enough to know what panic looks like across a planet, the market cascades, the emergency broadcasts, the politicians talking over each other on every channel. I had watched it happen to other species when the council moved against them. There was a pattern to it. Fear, then anger, then bargaining, then the long, slow grief of a people who had been told they were not wanted. Earth did not follow the pattern. The markets opened the next morning and moved sideways. Not down, not surging, just sideways. The way markets move when the people running them already knew something the public was only now learning. 3 major trading houses released statements within the first 2 hours. All 3 used the same phrase, which I found interesting. We anticipated this scenario. The politicians did talk, of course, but the ones who were given camera time were not the ones shouting. They were calm. They spoke about Earth's independent development programs, about the Sovereign Corridor Initiative, about colony systems that were, they mentioned almost casually, already fully operational and not reliant on council transit infrastructure. I sat in my shuttle seat and watched my planet respond to the worst diplomatic rejection in human history by being, more or less, fine. I want to be clear about something. Being fine did not mean being happy. I spoke to my brother Colin the day after the vote. He was an engineer on one of the outer research stations, and the transit lane closures were going to make resupply complicated for a few months. He was not happy about that. My colleague Ruth, who ran the cultural exchange program and had spent 6 years building relationships with 3 council species, was devastated. Those relationships were not political abstractions. They were real. Real friendships, real shared work, real things that the council had just made much harder to maintain. The cost was real. I want to be honest about that. But there is a difference between cost and catastrophe, and what the council had not understood, what they had fundamentally, structurally failed to model, was that humanity had spent the better part of 30 years making sure this particular action could never be catastrophic for us. Let me explain what Protocol Sovereign actually was. The Council's intelligence on Earth was, by galactic standards, very good. They had observers. They had data from our own submitted reports. They had 60 years of watching us up close. They knew our population numbers, our energy production, our listed military assets, our official colony count. They had a thorough, well-maintained, carefully analyzed picture of humanity. It was just not the full picture. Protocol Sovereign was the name we gave to the project we had been running quietly underneath everything the Council could see. It had started as a contingency plan. What do we do if membership is permanently denied? And over 3 decades it had grown into something far larger than contingency. It was, by the time the Council invoked the Containment Accord, a nearly complete parallel infrastructure. Our own FTL corridor network, built through unclaimed dark space routes the Council had never bothered to chart. Our own relay stations, small and cold and invisible to passive scans. Our own trade agreements with species on the outer edges of Council space, conducted through intermediaries and worded in ways that did not technically require Council approval. And 17 colony systems that did not appear on any document we had ever submitted to the Council. I need to say that clearly. 17 fully operational human colony systems, home to a combined population of about 40 million people, none of which the Council had any record of. They had their own power grids, their own food production, their own manufacturing. They had been growing quietly for 20 years. The people living there had built real communities, raised families, developed local cultures that were distinctly human and entirely invisible to the organization that had just decided to contain us. The Council thought they were locking a door. They had locked the front door of a building that already had 17 side exits they did not know about. The morning after the vote, a woman named Laura Holt, the director of Protocol Sovereign, who had spent 15 years of her life building this thing and deserved a great deal more recognition than she ever received, sent me a single message. All systems nominal. Corridor 1 through 8 are live. We're ready when you are. I was still on the shuttle. I read that message 3 times. Corridor 1 through 8 meant 8 independent FTL routes connecting Earth's official systems to the hidden colonies and to 24 trading partners who had been waiting quietly for exactly this moment. Ready when you are meant that the moment the Council's transit restrictions fully engaged, we had our own network live and operational, and the Council could not touch a single node of it because not one node existed within their jurisdiction. 2 days after the vote, the Veth Confederation formally withdrew from the Council. The Veth were one of the 2 species that had voted in our favor. They were not a large or militarily significant species. They were known mostly for their extraordinary skill in materials science and their very long memories. They had watched what the Council did to smaller, weaker species over the centuries. They had voted against us once, 12 years earlier, on a separate matter. But they had voted for us on membership, and when the Council made its move, they invoked a reciprocal trade clause that was buried in their original membership agreement, declared that the Council's action violated the spirit of galactic cooperation, and simply left. The Sorathi followed 1 week later. The Sorathi were larger, more commercially significant, and they had been running a quiet joint materials research program with Earth for 8 years that had never been disclosed to the Council. When they left, they brought 3 other small member species with them, species that had been looking for an exit and needed someone else to go first. The Council lost 6 members in 10 days. They had expected Earth to be isolated. They had created the opposite condition. By drawing a line and declaring us to be on the wrong side of it, they had revealed to every species that had its own quiet grievances with the Council's authority exactly where that line was, and they had given those species a reason to choose a side. Laura and her team activated Corridor 1 on a Tuesday, the first human freighter to travel through an independent, non-Council FTL lane did so without ceremony, carrying a load of processed minerals from one of the hidden colony systems to a Veth distribution hub. It was a completely ordinary cargo run. Nobody made a speech. The crew checked their instruments, confirmed the route was clear, and went. I watched the telemetry from my desk at the temporary mission office I had set up while Claire handled the formal checkout from the Council station. The freighter completed the run in 11 hours. Clean passage, no interference, no incidents. I made a note in my personal log, 3 words, Corridor 1 nominal. Then I went to make another coffee and started reviewing the list of species that had quietly sent us messages in the past 72 hours, asking, carefully, cautiously, not committing to anything yet, what trade arrangements might look like in the new structure. There were 41 of them. Not coincidentally, that was exactly the number of delegates on the Galactic Council. The Council released a public statement calling Earth's independent corridor network a provocative and destabilizing action. They demanded we shut it down pending review. They described our agreements with the departing species as unlawful under Interstellar Commerce Code. Laura read the statement and sent me a note. They wrote a strongly worded letter, noted. I replied, file it. She did. Meanwhile, the human colony of Pharaoh's Point, one of the 17 hidden systems, a mining community of about 200,000 people who had been living entirely off-grid for 12 years, held what they described as a "we exist now" celebration. They sent pictures, children in handmade clothes holding signs that said things like, "We've been here the whole time," in large, cheerful letters. I kept one of those pictures. I still have it. The Council had wanted to make us small. They had voted to shrink our world, our options, our future. What they had done instead was remove the last reason we had for pretending to be smaller than we were. The corridor network grew by 2 additional routes that month. The hidden colonies updated their status from contingency to active. The trade inquiries from Nervous Council fringe species became more direct, more specific, more serious. And I began drafting the terms we would eventually present to the Council, terms I was certain they would one day need to accept. Because I had seen the look on Laura's face when she showed me the long-range scan data from the outer rim. Something was coming from the dark space beyond the galaxy's edge, something none of us had seen before. And when it arrived, the Council was going to have a very serious problem that strongly worded letters could not solve. Threshold Prime was not what the Council had expected. I know this because I watched their delegation arrive. 3 senior diplomatic officers and 2 intelligence observers who were trying very hard not to look like intelligence observers. And I watched their faces as the shuttle bay doors opened, and they saw the interior for the first time. They had expected, I think, something modest. A human outpost, maybe. A working station, functional and plain, the kind of thing a recently isolated species might build in a hurry to prove a point. Something that said, we are surviving without you. What they saw instead said something else entirely. Threshold Prime was a deep space station positioned at the intersection of 6 of our sovereign corridors, in a region of unclaimed space about 40 light-years from the nearest Council-controlled system. It had taken 4 years to build. Its main hub was 3 kilometers across. Its docking capacity handled over 200 vessels simultaneously. It had residential sections for 60,000 permanent residents, a full medical complex, 3 separate research facilities, manufacturing bays capable of producing mid-sized spacecraft from raw materials, and a market district that had become, in the past several months, one of the busiest commercial exchanges in this part of the galaxy. The Council delegate, a sharp-eyed woman named Arbitress Nella Voss, who I had dealt with before and respected, despite everything, for her intelligence and directness, walked out of the shuttle bay and stood on the main observation deck and looked out at the interior of the station for a long, silent moment. Then she turned to me and said, very quietly, "How long have you been building this?" 4 years for this station, I said. 30 years for everything that made this station possible. She absorbed that. We didn't know. No, I said, you didn't. I led her delegation through the main corridor. Around us, Threshold Prime moved at its usual pace, crew members in gray and blue heading to their posts, merchant representatives from a dozen species negotiating in the side lounges, children from the residential section chasing each other through the wide public walkways, research teams moving between facilities with the focused energy of people who had too much to do and not enough hours to do it in. I had asked Claire to arrange for something in the meeting room. When we arrived, there was a table, chairs sized for multiple species, water, and a small pot of coffee. Real coffee, ground from beans grown in the agricultural section of one of our hidden colonies, which had, it turned out, excellent growing conditions. I poured a cup and offered it to Arbitress Voss. She looked at it. She had, I knew, never tried it before. Most Council species hadn't, because Earth's agricultural exports had been limited and our food was not well distributed through official channels. She took the cup, she smelled it, she tasted it. Something shifted in her expression, not dramatically, just slightly, the way a person looks when they encounter something they did not expect to be as good as it is. "This is from Earth?" she asked. "From Pharaoh's Point, actually," I said. "Colony system, they've been growing it for 8 years. The soil conditions are very good." She set the cup down carefully. "Ambassador Garrett." "Owen," I said, "I think we're past titles." She considered that. "Owen, I want you to understand that what happened in the Grand Deliberation Hall was not something I voted for enthusiastically. The Containment Accord was a significant overstep," I said. "Yes, I know you were outvoted." "I was." "So was Earth," I said, "for 60 years. She looked at me. Then she looked down at the coffee. Then she looked out at the corridor where, through the transparent wall, Threshold Prime continued its ordinary, extraordinary business. "The 6 species that left with the Veth," she said. "They're trading through your corridor network now." "Through the sovereign network, yes. Corridor rates are competitive. We don't charge political alignment fees." She understood what I meant. The Council's trade network had, for centuries, charged what amounted to political cooperation levies on any species that wanted to use the faster lanes. It was dressed up in various kinds of administrative language, but the effect was simple. Do what the Council wants, pay less. Cause friction, pay more. It was an elegant system of control, and it had worked well for thousands of years. It worked less well when there was an alternative. 11 more species have inquired about sovereign network access in the past 3 weeks, I told her. Not requesting it, inquiring, they're being cautious. They're watching to see whether the Council responds to what we've built by escalating or by adapting. I leaned forward slightly. "Arbitress, you came here for something. Not to see the station, though I appreciate that you're seeing it. What did the Council send you to say?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The Council is prepared to open a new dialogue on Earth status." I waited. The terms of the containment accord are, there is a growing view that their application in this case was perhaps not the most proportionate response. "Perhaps not," I agreed. "There are members who believe a review." "Arbitress," I said, with respect, "I have been in meetings with the Council for 11 years. I know what a review means. A review means we talk for 2 years and nothing changes, and the talking itself is held up as evidence that the Council is open-minded and reasonable." I picked up my own coffee. "I'm not interested in a review." She looked at me directly. "What are you interested in?" "Full membership," I said. "Dissolution of the containment accords application to Earth. Recognition of the sovereign network as independent infrastructure outside Council jurisdiction, and a formal acknowledgement, entered into the permanent public record, that the vote was conducted without adequate consideration of the evidence Earth presented." "That last point is the one the Council will find most uncomfortable," I said. "Yes. It's also the one that matters most to the 60 million humans who grew up being told that the most powerful body in the galaxy had looked at our species and decided we were too dangerous to include." She was quiet. Outside the meeting room, someone was laughing in the corridor, a genuine, unguarded laugh, the kind that fills a space without trying to. "I'll carry your terms back," she said finally. "I know you will," I said. "And I know the Council will debate them. Take your time." I refilled her coffee cup because it was the right thing to do. "We're not going anywhere." She stayed 3 hours. I showed her the research facilities, where teams from Earth and 4 other species were working side by side on materials science and propulsion systems that were, by any honest assessment, a generation ahead of what the Council's own labs were producing. I showed her the market district, where she watched a Veth merchant close a deal with a human trader with the easy comfort of people who had been doing business together long enough to trust each other. I showed her the observation deck, where the sovereign corridor entry points were visible as faint shimmer lines in the dark, 8 routes connecting us to a network that the Council did not control and could not shut down. She left without committing to anything specific, but at the shuttle bay door she turned back. 30 years, she said. "You built all of this in 30 years." "We started with nothing," I said. "We're used to working from that position." She held my gaze for a long moment. Then she nodded once and boarded her shuttle. I watched it leave. Then I went back to my desk where a message from Laura was waiting. The long-range scan arrays at the edge of Corridor 6 had picked up something new. It was not a natural phenomenon. It was moving. It was moving fast. And it was coming from a region of space that, according to every database the Council had ever compiled, contained nothing. I read the scan data 3 times. Then I called Laura directly. How confident are we? I asked. Very, she said. Her voice was careful. Owen, whatever this is, it's big, and it's headed straight for the Council's border systems. I sat back and thought about Arbitress Voss, on her way home to a council chamber full of people who had, until very recently, been completely certain that their biggest problem was us. Get me everything we have, I said, and tell the fleet commanders to move to elevated readiness, quietly. Already done, Laura said. Outside my window, the sovereign corridors shimmered in the dark. Something was coming, and the galaxy was about to discover that the species they had voted to contain was the only one prepared to face it. The first contact report came in at 3:40 station time, while most of Threshold Prime was asleep. I was not asleep. I had not been sleeping much in the 2 weeks since Laura's scan team first flagged the anomaly, because the follow-up data had been getting steadily worse in a very specific way. Not worse in the sense that the readings were deteriorating, but worse in the sense that each new scan made the picture clearer, and the clearer it became, the less I liked it. The entity, we were calling them the Drevkai, a name borrowed from the nearest translation of what our long-range acoustic sensors had picked up from their own communications, was not a single vessel. It was a fleet of a size that our most experienced analysts, people who had spent careers modeling galactic military capacity, had looked at 3 times before they would write down the number. More than 400 ships, and not small ones. They had emerged from a deep space region about 90 light-years beyond the Council's outermost border system, a region that showed up on charts as surveyed and empty, because the Council had sent probes through it 800 years ago and found nothing worth noting. Either those probes had missed something, or the something had arrived after them. Either way, the result was the same. An unknown force of extraordinary size was moving at high speed toward inhabited space, and nobody had seen it coming. The Council knew. They had their own scan networks, and the Drevkai were not trying to hide. They had no reason to hide. When you move 400 ships in formation, concealment is not really the point. What happened next told me everything I needed to know about the Council's actual capacity. They called an emergency session. Then they called another one. Then they formed a subcommittee. Then they debated the subcommittee's terms of reference. Then the subcommittee presented 3 options for a response framework, and the full Council debated those options across 7 sessions that ran over 4 days, while the Drevkai continued moving at the same speed in the same direction, completely indifferent to what was happening in the Grand Deliberation Hall. A border system called Verath Minor, home to about 2 million Cathara citizens, sent a distress signal on day 6. The Drevkai had not engaged them yet, but 3 Drevkai vessels had moved into close orbital range and were conducting what appeared to be scans, detailed, systematic, the kind you run when you are deciding whether something is worth taking rather than simply passing. The Council's response to the Verath Minor situation was to request that the Drevkai identify themselves through standard hailing protocols. The Drevkai did not respond to hailing protocols. This apparently came as a surprise. On day 9, I received a communication from a source I had not expected. A personal channel, not official, routed through 3 relay points in a way that was designed to be deniable. The sender identified herself as High Arbiter Doran, not the arbiter who had presided over Earth's rejection, but his direct superior, the senior executive authority of the entire Council. I had met her twice in 11 years. She was old even by the standards of the long-lived Cathara, and she had spent 60 of those years managing the Council. She was not someone who communicated casually. Her message was 6 words long: "We need to speak, please respond." I looked at that message for a while. Then I called Claire into my office and told her what I needed to arrange. A secure channel, fully encrypted, with a confirmation protocol that would verify both ends of the conversation. No record in the official Council logs. My terms, not theirs. Claire had it set up in 40 minutes. She was extremely good at her job. When High Arbiter Doran's image appeared on my screen, she looked like someone who had not slept in 9 days. The long, angular features of the Cathara, usually composed into something between dignity and mild disapproval, were showing something I had never seen on a Cathara face before. She was worried. She did not open with pleasantries, neither did I. "How much do you know?" she asked. "About as much as you do," I said, "possibly a little more. Our scan arrays on Corridor 6 have been tracking them for 2 weeks, better resolution than your outer network." She absorbed that without surprise. At this point, she had probably stopped being surprised by human capabilities she had not known about. "Then you understand the scope." "Yes," I said. 412 vessels as of this morning's count. Formation discipline is excellent. Speed is consistent, which means their navigation is centralized and confident. They have not responded to any contact attempts from any species, which means either they have no interest in communication at this stage or they don't consider it necessary. I paused. My analysts leaned toward the second interpretation. Doran was quiet for a moment. "The Council's Defense Committee met this morning. We have 107 warships that can be mobilized within 30 days, an additional 60 that would require 60 to 90 days. I did not say anything, because I did not trust myself to say what I was thinking in a way that would not damage the conversation. "Ambassador Garrett," she said, and the fact that she used my title told me she was preparing to say something formal. "The Council is prepared to authorize direct communication with Earth regarding." "High Arbiter," I said, "let's not do it this way." She stopped. "You called me on a private channel specifically to avoid the formal process," I said, "so let's be direct. The Council needs military assistance. Earth has it. You want to ask for it without making it official, because making it official means acknowledging what the vote meant and what the containment accord meant, and your coalition is not ready for that conversation yet." I looked at her steady. "I understand the political difficulty, but I cannot help you with a request that doesn't exist on the record." She was very still. "This matters to the people back home," I said, and I meant it with everything in me. Not as a tactic, as a fact. There are humans who grew up knowing that this council looked at us and said we were not good enough, not trustworthy enough, not safe enough to sit at the table with the rest of the galaxy. That stayed with them. It stayed with their children. You don't ask those people to send their ships and their crews into a fight for a council that is still too embarrassed to say out loud that it needs them. Doran looked at me. Her eyes were very old, and at that moment they held something I had not expected to see there, something that might have been grief. "What do you need?" she said. "I need the request made formally, on the official channel, the full council, broadcast across every network connected to the deliberation record. I need the High Arbiter on record saying that Earth's assistance is requested." I kept my voice level. "And I need it done before the Drevkai reach Verath Minor's inner orbit, because once they engage directly, the conversation changes." "The membership terms." "We can negotiate the full terms after the immediate situation is resolved," I said. "I'm not holding the galaxy hostage. I'm telling you what has to happen before I can stand in front of the people who would be going out there and give them a reason that means something." She was quiet for a long moment. Outside my window, Threshold Prime moved through its day. 40 million people in 17 hidden systems. 60 million people back on Earth. Hundreds of thousands of humans spread across the Sovereign Network and the Veth and Sorathi corridor connections, living their lives, raising children, doing science, growing coffee, building things that were slowly becoming the backbone of a new kind of galactic order. All of them, one way or another, waiting to hear what the galaxy thought of them now. "I will have to call a full session," Doran said slowly. "There will be members who refuse. Some of them represent systems that are currently between us and the Drevkai." I said. She understood. "Give me 12 hours, she said. "You have 10, I said. The Drevkai don't schedule around our meetings." She ended the call. I sat for a moment in the silence of my office. Then I pulled up the Sovereign Fleet Command channel and opened a line to Rear Admiral Nate Ford, who had been running fleet readiness exercises for the past 10 days, and who I knew was watching the same scan data I was. "Nate," I said. Owen, his voice was steady. He was always steady. It was the thing I appreciated most about him. "How ready are we?" "Ready," he said. "We've been ready." "Good," I said. "Stay close to your comm. This is going to move fast." It moved in 9 hours and 42 minutes. The Council convened a full emergency session. The vote to formally request Earth's military assistance passed 17 to 14, with 10 abstentions. 3 of the 14 who voted against represented systems that were within 2 transit jumps of the Drevkai's current position. The request was broadcast on every open Council channel. I let it sit for 30 minutes, long enough for every human in the network to hear it, for every news relay to carry it, for every species watching to understand what had just happened. And then I opened the official response channel. "Earth accepts the request," I said. "The Sovereign Fleet is authorized to engage. Be advised, our ships will operate under Earth Command Authority. We welcome coordination with Council forces, but command structure is Earth's." There was a long pause on the other end. Then someone, not Doran, someone on the Council floor said, "Understood." I closed the channel, then I called Nate. "Move," I said. The Sovereign Fleet came out of Corridor 6 at 6:14 on a Thursday morning, and the first thing I heard from the Council's military observation post was silence. Not the silence of a technical failure, the silence of people looking at something they had not expected and needing a moment to process it. The Council's military observers had been told Earth was sending ships. They had done their best to estimate what that meant, based on the assets they knew about, the officially listed human military vessels, the ones Earth had been required to disclose during observer admission. That list described a capable, modest fleet, the kind of fleet a mid-sized species maintains as a deterrent. Nate's fleet was not that fleet. 280 warships came through Corridor 6 in a single coordinated emergence sequence that took 11 minutes. They were not built the way Council ships were built, long, elegant, optimized for the specific physics of Council standard FTL lanes. Human ships were shorter, denser, designed around an engineering philosophy that prioritized flexibility over refinement. They could change formation in seconds. They shared targeting data at speeds that made the observer's sensors throw calibration errors, because the communication rate was faster than the sensors were designed to track. The Council observer who managed to compose himself first sent us a message that simply read, "How many of those do you have?" I replied, "Enough for today." The Drevkai had reached Verath Minor's inner orbital zone and had, in the past 6 hours, disabled 2 Cathara patrol ships that moved to intercept them. No fatalities. The Drevkai had done it with surgical precision, the way you do when you are demonstrating capability rather than committing to combat. They wanted the system's occupants to understand what was happening before anything irreversible occurred. That told us something. They were not mindless, they were methodical. Nate spent 40 minutes reviewing the scan data before he moved a single ship. 40 minutes of watching, analyzing, comparing the Drevkai's formation geometry and movement patterns with everything our modeling teams had put together. When he was done, he sent me a single note. "They're good. We're better." I trusted Nate. I had known him for 8 years. He was not a person who said things like that carelessly. The engagement began at 11:40 station time. I watched it on the tactical display in Threshold Prime's command center, surrounded by Laura and her team, by Claire, by a handful of Council observers who had requested to watch from our facility and whom I had allowed in because I wanted them to see. Nate split the fleet into 6 groups. Not 5, not 7, 6. a number that created an engagement geometry the Drevkai's formation could not efficiently counter without either compressing together, which would make them a denser target, or spreading out, which would break their communication coherence. He had seen, in 40 minutes of watching, that their formation depended on tight proximity for the fleet-wide coordination they were using. He gave them a choice between two problems, and then he let them choose. They chose to compress. The next 4 hours were the most precise, most controlled, most technically demanding military engagement in human history, and I am aware that I am biased. But the council observers were there, and they said the same thing afterward, independently in their reports. They had never seen fleet coordination like it. Human ships do not fight in straight lines. They flow. They share information so quickly that a decision made by one ship's commanding officer is implemented across 30 ships before the decision has been verbally communicated. They lose ships. We did lose ships, 11 of them, and every one of those is a number that contains multitudes, contains people who had names and families and coffee preferences and plans for what they were going to do when the tour ended. I need to say that clearly. We were not invincible, we paid a price. But we stopped them. Not just slowed, stopped. The Drevkai advance halted. Their forward units, which had been moving with the confidence of something that had never been seriously challenged, pulled back. Their formation changed from offensive geometry to something that our analysts read as assessment posture, the formation you hold when you are re-evaluating what you are facing. By hour 5, the Drevkai fleet had retreated to a position 40 light minutes from Vareth Minor and stopped moving. Nate held his position. He did not pursue. That was the call I was most proud of, the decision not to chase, not to press the advantage into territory we did not need to take, not to turn a defensive action into something that would look like aggression. He stopped where stopping made sense. He held the line. At 18:20 station time, I received a communication from a Drevkai vessel. It was not a hailing protocol. It was a frequency, a specific, narrow frequency that our communication analysts said carried the mathematical signature of an inquiry rather than a statement. They wanted to talk. I told Nate to keep the fleet exactly where it was, and I opened the channel. The conversation lasted 6 hours and will be the subject of a great many historical analyses that are not mine to write. What I will say is this: the Drevkai were not what we had feared, which does not mean they were not dangerous, because they were. But they were also coherent. They had intent and logic. They had come from the deep rim because something had pushed them out, something behind them that they were not ready to describe in detail, but that I believed was real, because nothing about the way they communicated suggested they had any interest in deception. They had not known there were inhabited systems in this direction, or they had known, but had not known the inhabited systems were of any significance, or they had known and had decided to test what resistance they would face. The translation was imperfect, and I am being honest about that imperfection. What I knew by the end of those 6 hours was that this was not over. The Drevkai were not defeated. They were paused, and whatever was behind them was the larger problem. But the immediate crisis had passed. At 200 station time on Friday, I went back to my office. I poured a coffee. I looked out the window at the sovereign corridors shimmering in the dark, and at the stars beyond them, and at the vast, complicated darkness that held all of this, all the species and all the history and all the slow, grinding work of building something worth protecting. 3 days later, the council convened in full session. This time, I was not in the observer section. I was at the main table, in a seat that had never had a human in it before. They signed every term: full membership, dissolution of the containment accord, recognition of the sovereign network, and the formal acknowledgement, read aloud by High Arbiter Doran, entered into the permanent record, broadcast on every open channel in the network, that Earth's rejection had been conducted without adequate consideration, and that the Council regretted the harm it had caused. She did not rush through it. She read every word clearly, in a voice that carried no excuse and no deflection, only the plain statement of a thing that was true and needed to be said. The chamber was quiet when she finished. I did not applaud. Neither did the people with me. We just sat with it, the way you sit with something that has been a long time coming, not triumphant, not relieved exactly, just present, just there. Later, standing in the corridor outside the chamber, Claire handed me a coffee from her canister. The last of the Pharaoh's Point batch, she told me. She had been saving it. I took it. It was, as always, very good. In the chamber behind us, the council was beginning the work of figuring out how to face what was coming from the outer rim. It was going to be hard, complicated, expensive work. It was going to require the kind of coordination and commitment and plain stubbornness that, and I say this without arrogance, because it is simply what the record shows, humans are not bad at. We had been in the waiting room for 60 years, told to sit quietly, behave ourselves, not take up too much space. We had spent those 60 years building the corridors, and the colonies, and the fleet, and the network, and the friendships, and the relationships, and the capacity that now made us arguably the most significant power in the sector, not because we had conquered anything, but because we had refused to stop while they were busy telling us to. I looked out the corridor window at the stars. 11 of our people were not coming home. I was going to read every name, every record, every account of every one of them, because that was the only honest response to what they had given. Some things you do not summarize, some things you only carry. But the line had been held. The galaxy had been given time, and the species that the Galactic Council had voted to contain was now seated at the table where the future was going to be decided. I finished the coffee. It was, as I said, very good. We got back to work.